Hey guys, tonight we slip into something a little different, literally. You're going to walk the streets of ancient China, but instead of watching the grand parades or staring up at lofty pagodas, you'll be looking down. Down at the ground. Down at the shoes. And more importantly, you'll be listening. Because if you pay attention closely, history isn't always written in scrolls or carved in stone. Sometimes, it's scuffed into bricks, whispered in straw, or clattered in wood. And yes, you're about to find out exactly what shoes sounded like centuries ago. Spoiler, you probably wouldn't survive this without at least 3 pairs of spares. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first sound you hear is stone. Not the dramatic thunder of a drum or the clash of swords, just the flat, dusty slabs of an early morning market street. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the place is already alive. You trudge along, shoulders brushing baskets of spring onions, your ears tuned not to voices but to feet. Each pair tells a different story. The farmer hauling gourds. His straw sandals rasp against the stones with a rough, scratchy sigh, like a broom being dragged lazily across the floor. The vendor arranging dried fish. Her cloth shoes slap softly, almost apologetic, soles already worn thin from yesterday's trade. And the official striding through with a clerk's urgency. His leather boots thunk, each step heavy and decisive, like punctuation marks. Shoes were the soundtrack of daily life. In fact, in marketplaces of the Tang and Song dynasties, mornings were described in poetry as being woven from footsteps before woven with words. Historians still argue whether that was literal metaphor or just lyrical exaggeration, but standing here, well, listening here, you'd agree with the poets. The street sounds like a loom. And you notice quickly, class speaks through sound. The wealthy, slipping in silk slippers, produce barely more than a whisper. They glide, as if the ground isn't worthy of hearing them. Meanwhile, porters bent double under sacks of millet create a steady scuff, 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 the beat of survival. Shoes were subtle badges, announcing status in the rhythm of a step. You pause by a vendor ladling congee from a steaming pot. The man's sandals squeak every time he pivots, damp from splashes of broth. That squeak could drive you mad, or put you to sleep, depending on how generous your mood is. Imagine ASMR before microphones, a sleepy hiss of hemp rope on wet stone. And it's not just trade. Shoes also told time. Roosters crowed, yes, but markets also had their own clock, the crescendo of footsteps swelling with dawn, peaking at mid-morning, fading to a hush afternoon. The pulse of the city was measured in sols. Some scholars suggest the idea of city rhythm in China predates European notions by centuries, though others argue we're simply reading too much into poetic descriptions. Either way, you're walking proof of it tonight. Of course, not every shoe was pleasant. There's the pungent slap of fishmongers' hemp sandals soaked in river water, which gives off a smell that could knock you out faster than a bedtime story. And there's the ominous silence of soldiers' boots, not because they were quiet, but because crowds would fall silent when they approached. Even without raising a voice, authority clattered. By now, you realize, you could close your eyes and know where you were just by listening. A muddy squelch meant riverbank, a delicate shuffle, courtyard interior, a hollow clop, wooden bridge. Forget GPS, people navigated by sound cues long before satellites. But let's not get too romantic. Shoes also broke, often at the worst possible time. Imagine trudging through the market and suddenly feeling one sandal string snap, flopping uselessly like a fish on land. Historical texts mention merchants carrying spare hemp cords, since sandals frayed faster than you could say, price increase. One cheeky poet even joked, sandals age faster than emperors, which feels uncomfortably true when you've walked 10 miles in them. You stop by a cobbler's corner stall where repairs are already underway. The tap-tap of a tiny hammer blends with morning footsteps. Shoes may seem like an afterthought to history, but here, you realize they're the thread holding everything together. Without soles, no one moves grain, no one reaches temples, no one gathers at markets. And so you keep listening. Step after step, dawn after dawn, you're weaving together the map of China through sound alone. It's not glamorous, but then again, neither is sleep. And both, oddly enough, are necessary for survival. The river air is cool, carrying the damp scent of reeds and mud, and as you step closer to the water's edge, you hear it before you see it. A long, wet hiss, as though the earth itself is exhaling. That, my friend, is the sound of straw sandals sliding against a muddy riverbank. And it is the song of fishermen, ferrymen, and anyone else unlucky enough to work where land turns into water. You trudge along the bank, the reeds brushing your legs, and your ears tune into the rhythm. S-H-T, step, S-H-T, step. Hemp or straw, it didn't matter much. Both frayed quickly, both soaked up river water like sponges, and both squeaked in a way that could only be described as shoes trying to sing. Of course, not everyone found this endearing. Imagine having to listen to it for 12 hours while hauling nets of carp. You might start wishing for a silent pair of slippers too. The construction was deceptively simple. Fishermen twisted reeds and hemp fibers into ropes, then wove them tight across a sole platform. They left little spaces so water could drain quickly, because trust me, nobody likes walking around with shoes that feel like water balloons. Historical records describe these sandals as quick to dry, cheap to lose. A practical design philosophy that would make IKEA proud. And the sound was its own reassurance. On mornings thick with mist, you couldn't see much farther than the prow of your boat, but you could hear your neighbor's sandals rasping along the dock planks. That scratchy hiss was proof you weren't alone. It was the village heartbeat, and when it went silent, you'd better worry that something had gone wrong, like a crocodile sliding closer. And yes, crocodiles did once haunt the southern rivers. Historians still argue whether locals exaggerated the danger in their writings, but if you just lost a sandal in murky water, you wouldn't wait around to find out. There's another quirk. Straw sandals had a short life, so fishermen became expert at weaving their own. Some could braid a pair in under half an hour. Imagine that, you break a sandal string mid-morning, sit down, weave another from reeds by your feet, and you're back in business by lunchtime. That's a repair speed no luxury sneaker brand has ever promised you. And no, they didn't offer overnight shipping either. If you listen more carefully, you'll notice how terrain changes the tune. On dry dirt paths, the sandals scuff softly, like brooms sweeping sand. On planked ferries, they scrape with a rasp that almost sounds like someone sharpening knives. And in deep mud, well, it's the classic suction cup noise. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Fisher kids probably laughed at the sound, proof that bodily humor has always been a timeless source of amusement. One Song Dynasty poem describes a ferryman by the sound of his shoes alone, reeds in hand, sandals wheeze, ferrying travelers through fog. That line has always made scholars pause. Was wheeze a poetic metaphor, or was it really how those sandals sounded when sodden? Historians still argue whether the poet was exaggerating or simply transcribing what he heard. Either way, you can almost picture it, an old ferryman, every step of his sandals squeaking as if they're sighing under the weight of another day. The riverbank itself became a stage for improvisation. Slip your sandal on a patch of algae and, whoop, down you go, headfirst into the mud. The good news? Those sandals dried quickly. The bad news? Everyone heard you fall, because nothing disguises the comedic squeak of straw soles losing their grip. A fisherman slipping is basically the slapstick routine the village didn't know it needed. Of course, sandals weren't just tools, they also carried small rituals. Before casting a net, some men tapped their sandals twice on the planks, a gesture part habit, part superstition. Was it to knock off mud, or to ask the river gods for luck? Nobody can quite say, but the sound, two sharp scrapes, became an omen of sorts. Villagers listening in the morning mist would hear that and think, ah, the nets are about to fly. And children, don't forget them. Kids wore miniature versions of these sandals, and if you've ever tried to make a child walk carefully on slippery boards, you know how that went. The result was often a loud splush followed by giggles and one furious mother weaving new sandals for the week. Archaeologists have even found tiny woven soles preserved in river muck, proof that toddlers were indeed tottering around, squeaking their way into history. The soundscape of the riverbank wasn't just sandals, of course. You had the slosh of buckets, the creak of boats, the slap of fish tails. But the sandals stitched it all together. Every rasp and squeak was a kind of percussion, turning the dock into one giant watery drum kit. Modern field recorders would have had a field day, no pun intended. And so you stand there, listening. S-E-H-T, step, squelch, step, squeak, step. Every shoe is part of the orchestra, every fisherman an unwitting percussionist. And if you close your eyes, you might not even need the river view to know where you are. The sandals have told you everything already. You move away from the river now, feet drying as you shuffle into a narrow neighborhood lane. The air changes, Less damp, more dusty, with the faint smell of bean curd frying somewhere nearby. And beneath it all, a new sound begins to emerge. It isn't the rasp of straw, or the squeak of wet reeds, but something softer, layered, almost springy. These are the cloth shoes with thousand-layer soles, perhaps the most iconic sound of everyday walking in China for centuries. You hear it first as a muted thump on the packed earth. A woman hurries past you, balancing a basket of cabbages. Her shoes don't scrape or squeak. They give a gentle, cushioned pat, the kind of sound you might mistake for someone clapping politely under a blanket. If straw sandals sang like reeds, cloth shoes hummed like pillows. A grandmother sits cross-legged by her doorway, needle in hand, stitching a fresh sole. She has a stack of old rags beside her, shirts, quilts, even the sleeve of a grandson's jacket. Every scrap of fabric finds its way into the sole, layer by layer, pasted and pressed until it forms a dense cushion. Some soles had up to 1,000 layers, though most were fewer. Historians still argue whether "thousand layer" was ever literal or just a phrase meaning a lot. Either way, it sounded good, and the shoes felt better. You crouch down, running your fingers over a finished pair. The sole is surprisingly heavy, but springy, too. When the grandmother sets the shoe down on brick, it makes a dull, dignified tap, the kind of sound that says, "I've been around, and I'll be around tomorrow." Unlike the fragile reed sandals, these shoes were built to last. There's also a kind of poetry in their recycling. Imagine walking each day literally cushioned by the ghosts of old clothing. The laugh-stained sleeve of a festival robe, the worn patch of a farmer's work pants, all stitched into the layers beneath your step. Every footfall was a family archive, pressed flat. But durability came with quirks. Once the soles soaked through, they took ages to dry, and the resulting smell was, let's call it memorable. A Song Dynasty household manual even advised sprinkling medicinal herbs between the layers, to refresh the air. Which is a polite way of saying, yes, your shoes will stink. The sound of these shoes varied with terrain, and you notice that as you walk further. On brick streets, they give a quiet, sticky slap, like dough pressed against a cutting board. On polished wood, they glide with a whisper, almost frictionless. And on packed dirt, they're so silent you wonder if you're floating. Soldiers complained that you could be startled by someone wearing cloth shoes because you wouldn't hear them coming until they were right behind you. Sneaky, yes, but practical for a surprise dumpling delivery. Children wore smaller versions too, often embroidered with bright designs. One boy skips past you now, his soles pattering faster than the grown-ups. On his shoes, the embroidery shows a pair of tiny tigers, meant to ward off evil spirits. Except, with each jump, those tigers look more like they're dancing badly at a wedding. Still, the sound is joyful. And let's not forget the cobblers. In alley workshops, you'd hear the busy percussion of needles piercing fabric, the crunch of hemp paste being spread between layers, and the tap-tap-tap of hammers compacting the soles. It was its own music, keeping pace with the city outside. If you'd lived here, you'd probably know whether it was morning or afternoon just by how loud the hammering was. There's one quirky tidbit. Some accounts describe people deliberately exaggerating their steps in cloth shoes to signal their presence indoors. Without that extra stomp, they were too quiet. Imagine tiptoeing into a room and everyone jumping because they hadn't heard you arrive. So, people developed a kind of shoe language, a louder pat meaning, "It's me, don't be startled." Not quite Morse code, but close enough for family life. Scholars also debate whether cloth shoes contributed to posture. Some argue their flat, cushioned soles encouraged a steadier gait. Others dismiss this as nostalgic folklore. All we know for certain is that the shoes left an impression, not just in dirt, but in how footsteps were remembered in poetry. One Tang poet described his friend as, "the man whose cloth shoes sound like home." And that's really what these shoes did best. They softened life's edges. After the sharp rasp of straw, the clack of clogs, the slap of boots, here was a shoe that whispered. That whispered across bricks, through courtyards, down alleys. You walk on, the thousand layers cradling every step like a lullaby, until you realize you're almost nodding off just listening to them. The rain arrives without warning. One moment, you're strolling beneath gray skies, the next, the heavens open, and the streets gleam with running silver. And just like that, the soundscape changes. Cloth shoes and straw sandals aren't much help here. They soak through, they squelch, they betray their wearers with every slippery shuffle. But listen closely, because a different rhythm cuts through the downpour, the hollow, decisive clop of southern wooden clogs. You step under the tiled eaves of a tea house, but your ears stay outside. Clogs strike the rain-polished flagstones with a proud cadence. Clop, clop, clop. It's not a delicate sound, it's the kind of sound that says, I am dry, and you are not. The raised wooden platforms keep the foot lifted above puddles, mud, and whatever else might be lurking in the street. Yes, practicality often sounds smug. The clogs themselves were simple, a flat wooden base, sometimes carved with two supporting blocks underneath, and straps across the top to secure the foot. Lightweight enough to walk in, but tall enough to lift you above ankle-deep puddles. Think of them as ancient rain boots, but with the acoustics of a xylophone. Each step echoed louder depending on how wet the street was. The wetter the stone, the sharper the clop. It wasn't just about dryness. In southern cities like Hangzhou, where rain was more common than not, clogs created their own city music. Imagine hundreds of people moving through alleys at once, each pair hammering out a rhythm on stone. Together, they sounded like 100 carpenters testing wooden planks. One song poet described it as, a city of frogs, perhaps unkind, but you can almost hear it, a chorus of hollow notes bouncing in the rain. Historians still argue whether this comparison was affectionate or an insult, but if you've ever walked in wooden clogs, you'd probably lean toward insult. Of course, there were hazards. Clogs raised your feet above water, yes, but they also made you less stable. One bad step, one slick patch, and down you went, clattering like dropped furniture. Entire comedy sketches probably played out this way. Even today, you can imagine kids laughing at the sight of a neighbor sliding across the street like a broken wheelbarrow. Still, there was charm. In quieter lanes, the rhythm softened, clop becoming tap, tap becoming whisper. Couples walking together often synchronized their clogs, deliberately or not, creating a gentle duet beneath umbrellas. Imagine love expressed not in words, but in perfectly matched footsteps echoing in the drizzle. Move over, Shakespeare, romance was already happening on damp cobblestones. Clogs also had personality. Some were painted or carved with patterns, waves, cranes, lucky characters, turning what might have been dull utility into wearable art. One traveler in the Yuan dynasty even remarked that southern markets displayed clogs, in colors fit for festivals, though they sound like carpenters at work. Which is historian speak for, they looked nice, but please, someone invent rubber already. You shuffle further into the wet street, trying a pair yourself. The first step feels odd, like balancing on stilts. The second is easier. By the third, you understand the rhythm. Lift, drop, clop. Lift, drop, clop. It's hypnotic, and soon you're walking in time with the rain itself, your clogs drumming against stone while water trickles from roof tiles. There's also a curious etiquette here. Indoors, clogs were often left at the threshold. People padded barefoot or switched to softer shoes once inside. So the clop of clogs wasn't just a rain sound, it was a signal of arrival. A house might be quiet, until, clop, clop, someone came home. Families recognized each other by the tempo. A fast, uneven clop. That was a child, hurrying. A measured, heavy clop. That was the father, back from work. Some scholars even argue that wooden clogs shaped regional memory of soundscapes. In southern operas and plays, stage footsteps often mimicked clog rhythms. Was this art imitating life, or life imitating art? Historians still debate it. What you can be sure of is that the city's identity clattered through every wet alley, long before anyone thought to write it down. And just when you think you've had enough of the racket, the rain eases, the puddles shrink, and the clopping dies down into silence. But you'll remember it. Because nothing sounds quite like walking above the water, wooden soles beating time against the storm. You step off the rain-slick street and duck beneath a wooden gate into a quiet courtyard. The sudden hush hits you first, like someone pressed a pillow against the world. And then you notice it, the sound of silk slippers gliding across polished floors. There's no squelch, no clop, no rasp. Just a soft, swishing whisper, like clouds brushing over tiles. You probably won't survive if you try tiptoeing here with heavy boots, because etiquette alone could break you. So, before you get too comfy in this interior, take a moment to imagine the scene: courtyard walls rising, potted plants nudging corners, bamboo mats neatly rolled, and every footfall measured. And yes, before you drift off too far, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to tell me your location and local time, so we can map this quiet life across centuries together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease further into the story. The first slipper slides in, announcing a matron carrying a tray of tea. Each step makes a gentle swish that barely disturbs the quiet, but carries its own rhythm. The silk stretches just so over the top of the foot, producing a soft friction sound you might call a sigh. Children practicing their lessons in a corner tiptoe in even quieter slippers, creating a duet of faint rustles as pencils scratch ink on paper. You can hear the difference between hurried steps and measured ones, as if each person communicates intentions through the sound of their footwear. Silk slippers weren't only about sound, they were a statement. Embroidery, color, and even the curl of the toes signaled rank, wealth, or domestic role. One scholar notes that some families even had secret stitching patterns passed down generations, almost like a sonic signature. Historians still argue whether these signals were universally understood or mostly ceremonial, but standing here, you can almost sense the dialogue between floors and soles. The soft slap of silk on polished wood is hypnotic, and you notice small quirks. A matron may drag a slipper slightly to warn a servant, or a young girl may tap in rhythm to entertain herself. Every subtle nuance adds layers to the courtyard soundscape. It's easy to imagine ancient poets describing such moments as footfalls breathing secrets. And yet, this delicate harmony hides practical reality. Silk is fragile, rain or puddles from the previous street walk could stain or stretch it. Courtyard etiquette demanded extra care. Remove shoes before stepping on mats, adjust embroidery so that the cymbals face inward, and maintain balance while carrying trays of tea. One wrong shuffle and the sound becomes a squeak, betraying your presence. That squeak, minor as it seems, could echo in a hushed hall longer than a shouted word. You wander deeper into the courtyard. Bamboo mats absorb much of the sound, but the polished wooden path through the garden amplifies it, producing a whispering glide underfoot. Some poets suggest these soft sounds taught patience and mindfulness, turning the act of walking into meditation. Others think they merely enforced hierarchy. Either way, it is impossible not to slow your own steps, matching the rhythm of the slippers around you. And you notice a playful twist. Families sometimes encourage tiny children to practice walking silently in these slippers. You hear the miniature swish of toddlers, struggling to carry trays or mimic their elders, a delicate patter that evokes both comedy and tenderness. The sound of small steps reminds you that every courtyard is layered, not just in stones and mats, but in generations, stories, and careful etiquette, all whispered with silk beneath each foot. By now, you're attuned to subtleties. Each swish is a message, a meditation, a tiny punctuation in the day. The courtyard is alive, yet silent, speaking in sounds too soft for the untrained ear. And as you pause, leaning against the cool wooden post, you realize the beauty is in restraint, the deliberate hush of silk slippers gliding over floors that have heard centuries of careful, quiet steps. Stepping beyond the courtyard, you follow the sound of heavier steps onto the stone-paved roads where couriers and riders have left their mark for miles. Boots thud against worn cobbles, a rhythm meant for both speed and endurance, carrying letters, parcels, and messages that could change the fortunes of towns. Felt lined for warmth and with soles sturdy enough to withstand long treks, these boots carry the frontier beneath each step, their muffled percussion a reminder that travel in ancient China was never silent, even when diplomacy required discretion. You trudge alongside a mounted courier, feeling the saddle beneath you, the leather creaking in sync with his boots. The thump-thump of his steps on the stones merges with the swish of his cloak and the gentle jingle of his gear. The sound is strangely reassuring, like a heartbeat that guides both rider and messenger forward. Historians still argue whether couriers intentionally modified their gait for maximum endurance or if the boots themselves dictated the rhythm. Either way, you feel the subtle lesson: travel is not just measured in miles, but in the cadence of one step. Boots of this era weren't uniform. Some were tall, reaching mid-calf, with soft linings to prevent blisters on long treks, while others were short and flexible for agile movement in urban centers. You notice the slight squish when the soles press on damp earth, the faint scraping on rocky roads, and the muffled clatter on wooden bridges. Each surface transforms the same pair of boots into a different instrument, performing a constant, ambient symphony of travel. It's not all work. The fringe details are fascinating. Some couriers personalize their boots with subtle carvings or embossed patterns on the leather. A small swirl on the heel might indicate a family crest, while a stitched patch could serve as a talisman for safe passage. You might not see them at first glance, but the wearer knows, and anyone listening closely could interpret their silent codes. A little like Morse code, but for footsteps. You come across a courier adjusting his boots after wading through a muddy path. The felt-soled footwear absorbs water, softening the thud but creating a muffled, almost musical squish with each step. Travelers learn to navigate puddles carefully, adjusting pressure and gait to avoid loud splashes, which might betray their position, or worse, announce a missed delivery to a waiting official. Every misstep carries consequence, yet in practice, it creates a delicate rhythm across the landscape, a gentle percussion overlaying the natural sounds of wind, bird calls, and distant rivers. Beyond function, there's comfort. These boots cradle the foot, protect against frost, and even regulate warmth during nights on cold plains. Ancient travelers discovered that rhythm and endurance are tied together. The more uniform the step, the less strain on muscles and joints. And you notice it now, walking beside them, you unconsciously mirror their cadence, letting the sound dictate your own pace. On longer journeys, inns and rest stops became part of the sonic landscape. Each stop added its own subtle background notes, the scrape of boots on polished wooden floors, the creak of doors, the gentle clatter of a kettle heating over a hearth. Travelers learn to interpret these subtle cues, the sharp tap signaling someone arriving with urgency, a soft shuffle indicating a tired, careful approach. Historians still debate whether these auditory habits shaped community expectations of travelers or merely reflected centuries of practical necessity. And in the quiet moments between towns, when a courier paused atop a hill to look out over a valley, you noticed the soft whisper of felt against stone echoing faintly across fields. It's a sound that carries stories, letters of love, commands from governors, poetry in transit. Each boot tells you where it's been, how far it has come, and how patiently it endured the long, winding roads. Finally, as dusk approaches, you step off the path to watch the last courier disappear into a misty horizon, boots muffled by distance but still audible if you strain. The rhythm lingers in your mind, merging with the day's other footwear symphonies, straw sandals, cloth soles, silk slippers, and clogs. Travel, etiquette, survival, and subtle artistry all exist in each step, a soundtrack of ancient China composed in leather and felt. The sun tilts lower now, casting long shadows across the village streets, and you notice a different kind of movement, children returning from lessons, craftsmen closing shops, and market women winding down their day. With them comes a quieter, subtler layer of sound, woven slippers, hemp sandals, and even the occasional leather shoe rubbing softly against dust-laden stones. You probably wouldn't survive the chaos of a midday market, but at this hour, every step seems intentional, measured, almost meditative. You trudge alongside a small group of girls carrying baskets of herbs. Their woven slippers make a gentle brushing sound, so faint you could almost mistake it for wind rustling the bamboo leaves overhead. Yet each swish carries purpose, a silent conversation between the floor and foot, slow steps to avoid spilling the herbs, quick taps to signal a playful scold from a passing sibling. Historians still argue whether children were trained deliberately to walk quietly to cultivate discipline, or if it was just a natural consequence of caring for fragile goods. Either way, it's a sound that shapes the rhythm of childhood. Nearby, a blacksmith begins shutting his shop. The thick leather boots of his apprentices strike the wooden threshold with a dull thump. Every strike is deliberate, precise, a subtle percussive signal marking the end of work. You notice how shoes serve as markers of social structure, heavy boots for labor, soft cloth for study, silk slippers for the household elite. Even in absence of spoken words, the community communicates via footwear, a tacit code of movement and status. Some craftsmen personalize their shoes for comfort or practicality. A leatherworker adds padding for long hours standing, while a tailor may stitch extra layers underfoot to navigate cold stone floors. Oddly enough, these minor adjustments create new acoustic textures. Padding muffles sound, thin leather squeaks slightly, and roughened soles rasp against uneven tiles. Every modification alters the cadence, turning the village into a living orchestra of innovation. Children often emulate this soundscape. You hear a boy skipping ahead, his hemp sandals scraping and flapping in sync with his steps. He's learning both rhythm and caution. Jump too high, and your foot lands wrong, sending a scrape echoing against walls. Parents watch, sometimes smiling, sometimes grimacing at the potential embarrassment. There's a playful interplay between curiosity, risk, and auditory feedback. Courtyards offer a contrasting rhythm. Here, the sound is more controlled, slippers glide over polished planks, occasionally pausing on mats, creating soft, percussive taps. You notice the subtle differences between domestic and outdoor sounds. Cloth softens footsteps indoors, while wooden floors amplify, and stone or dirt streets exaggerate every heel lift. Walking from one space to another is like traveling through a miniature soundscape with its own rules. You pause near an elderly couple arranging lotus flowers for evening meditation. Their slippers slide lightly, barely touching the ground, producing an almost imperceptible shuffle. You lean closer, listening, realizing that for some, the absence of sound carries as much meaning as noise. Silence signals respect, attention, and ritual precision. It's both discipline and poetry, the audible reflection of inner calm. Even minor accidents reveal the acoustic complexity. A slipper caught on a mat's edge produces a sharp, singular sound, a brief punctuation in the otherwise fluid symphony. One might interpret it as annoyance, but you hear something different, a reminder that attention to detail is necessary, that every step is a choice. As the sun sinks behind the tiled rooftops, the village settles into its evening rhythm. Footwear, from woven sandals to silk slippers, has shaped your perception of time, hierarchy, and domestic life. Step by step, you've absorbed the language of motion, a careful blend of practicality, artistry, and subtle social signaling, and you realize that these everyday shoes tell far more than mere fashion or function, they tell the story of life itself. Twilight deepens, and the streets take on a muted, almost liquid quality. Lanterns flicker, casting pools of golden light that make the polished wooden floors of the alleys shimmer. In this half-light, you become aware of an entirely different class of footwear, lacquered shoes, stiff and ornate, reserved for officials or merchants returning from appointments. Their steps are deliberate, each strike resonating with authority, a sound that contrasts sharply with the soft whispers of cloth slippers and the gentle rustle of hemp. You follow a magistrate as he moves toward his residence. His lacquered shoes produce a crisp, almost metallic tap-tap-tap on the stone, punctuated by the echo of narrow lanes. The noise is not unpleasant, it carries precision and intent. Every movement communicates purpose, a kind of nonverbal assertion, I am present, I am in charge. You probably wouldn't survive a day trying to sneak past someone wearing these shoes, the sound alone announces your approach. The craftsmanship of lacquered shoes is remarkable. Multiple layers of lacquer harden the exterior, giving the shoes their distinctive rigidity and faint sheen. Occasionally, tiny painted motifs peek from the upper surface, subtle enough to catch the eye only if you're paying attention. These shoes weren't meant for speed, they were made to impress, to assert stature, and to maintain poise. Historians still argue whether the lacquer was primarily decorative or served a functional purpose, protecting leather from moisture and wear. Every step produces a microcosm of urban sound. Tap, pause, tap, the cadence carries over bridges, down alleys, and across courtyards. In narrow streets, the echo multiplies, creating a temporary symphony. You notice how bystanders instinctively adjust their own pace, either to match or avoid interfering with the rhythm of those in lacquered shoes. Footwear, you realize, choreographs the movement of an entire space. There's a playful quirk, officials sometimes employed attendants to carry documents, who wore softer shoes to minimize interference with the clack of lacquered footwear. The contrast between soft and rigid steps produces a layered effect, like different instruments in a gentle orchestra. Observing this, you can't help but imagine city planners using shoes as percussion in urban design. Silence in these streets is fleeting. Every shift in weight, every subtle lift of the heel, sends vibrations through the stones, picked up by others nearby. Children listening from windows learn to distinguish rank, intent, and urgency simply by interpreting these sounds. Some even place bets on who approaches based on the timbre of a footfall, a quiet way to train perception. You notice a merchant's shoes, slightly less rigid than the magistrate's, producing a softer, hollow tap. He hurries along, balancing a ledger under one arm. Each step has rhythm but lacks ceremonial weight. The difference in sound alone conveys occupation, temperament, and perhaps the day's mood. You begin to realize that the city is alive not just through speech or commerce, but through the variety of souls shaping its acoustic environment. The final observation for the evening is subtle yet captivating. A pair of lacquered shoes pauses mid-step, waiting for a friend to emerge from a side alley. The echo reverberates twice, a brief musical note against the soft backdrop of twilight. Such pauses, you notice, are as meaningful as movement. Even in a bustling street, silence, or the deliberate timing of sound, creates a sense of expectation, of ritual, of story. And as the lanterns settle into steady flickers, you stand quietly, absorbing this rich symphony. Leather, lacquer, cloth, straw, every material, every design, every choice of footwear contributes to a complex, living network of communication. These shoes do more than cover feet, they map society, hierarchy, and human interaction in sound, guiding the flow of life in every step. Night fully settles, and the village takes on a different personality. Streets that felt bustling in the day now seem to breathe slowly, as though the stone and wood themselves are exhaling. It's in this quiet that you hear something extraordinary, the subtle, almost imperceptible patter of indoor slippers on tatami mats and earthen floors, the soft rhythm of family life winding down. You probably wouldn't survive the day here without noticing how these sounds shape every corner of domestic space. Inside a modest home, a mother pads barefoot to the hearth, her silk-trimmed cloth slippers barely making a whisper. The thin fabric kisses the floor with every step, the sound so gentle it could almost be mistaken for a sigh. Meanwhile, children shuffle in smaller slippers, each movement measured, tentative, as though trying not to disturb the lingering warmth of evening prayers. Historians still debate whether this careful pacing was purely etiquette or also a subconscious method to teach mindfulness to the young. You follow the flow of sound from room to room. In the kitchen, hemp sandals scrape lightly against wooden planks as someone adjusts a steaming pot of congee. Outside, rain from earlier trickles softly against window eaves, adding another layer of ambient noise. The combination of footwear and environmental sounds produces a soothing, irregular rhythm, an oral reminder that even mundane tasks can be meditative. Some slippers are more elaborate than others. You notice embroidery along the edges, depicting flowers, dragons, or simple geometric motifs. As the wearer moves, the raised threads press lightly against the floor, producing a delicate texture in the sound. Imagine a tiny, invisible percussion section following each step, performing quietly for anyone patient enough to listen. Interestingly, some families trained their members to move with awareness. Each step was intentional, avoiding loud thuds or missteps, which could disturb sleeping children or neighbors. A misstep wasn't just a noise, it was a social faux pas. In contrast, outside the home, shoes could be heavier, louder, more declarative. The sound became context-dependent, a personal expression tuned to time and place. You pause near a low doorway where a grandparent is arranging lanterns. Their cloth slippers glide with a deliberate pace, generating a soft tap that punctuates the still air. It's almost musical, the kind of rhythm that could lull someone to sleep without them even realizing it. Each footfall resonates with generations of similar movements, creating a temporal connection between past and present. Children's slippers are a study in contrast. The little ones practice balance, learning to move without spilling water or tripping over thresholds. Their sounds vary from the tiniest swish to cautious, staccato taps, forming a subtle narrative of growth, learning, and play. Some scholars argue that these early auditory lessons contributed to discipline and attentiveness, while others suggest it was simply accidental, arising from practical necessity. The household pets contribute as well. A cat pads alongside you, its soft paws adding a faint counterpoint to human slippers. A dog pads in slower, heavier steps, reinforcing the layered soundscape of domestic life. Together, every creature, every footfall, and every careful shuffle becomes part of a gentle nocturnal symphony, one that defines not only the household but the mood of the entire evening. By the time you sit near the hearth, absorbing these sounds, you realize that footwear in ancient homes was far more than practical. Every material choice, silk, cloth, hemp, modulated the auditory atmosphere, shaping interactions, signaling status, and creating subtle aesthetic effects. Walking quietly is both art and ritual, a language of steps that connects generations and teaches patience without words. The night deepens, and now your footsteps carry you toward the outer edges of the village, where narrow alleys meet the small river that winds like a silver ribbon through the town. Here, sound behaves differently. Stone bridges amplify each step, while wooden planks on docks resonate in surprising ways. You notice the difference immediately. Simple straw sandals create a hollowing echo, whereas leather boots thud with authority, each beat announcing presence across the water. You probably wouldn't survive a misstep here, because a clumsy footfall could send ripples, alerting fishermen or neighbors alike. A fisherman adjusts his hemp sandals as he balances on a narrow dock. The soles brush lightly against damp boards, producing a muffled rasp, punctuated by occasional squelches when water seeps through the gaps. The tactile feedback is crucial. Too light a step, and he risks losing balance; too heavy, and the catch might spook. Historians still argue whether this careful adaptation to environment was conscious training or learned instinct, but as you watch, it feels deliberate, almost like a dance choreographed by necessity. Nearby, a pair of children practice skipping stones, their small cloth slippers scraping and swishing on planks with each hop and sprint. The rhythm is playful, irregular, a counterpoint to the measured steps of adults. You notice how the same material, cloth, can produce such variety depending on speed, weight, and intent. Every step tells a story: caution, excitement, mischief, or urgency. Fishermen's boots tell another story entirely. Tall and slightly worn, they produce a steady clop, muffled by the waterlogged dock yet confident enough to communicate presence. The leather has softened over months of exposure to saltwater and mud, creating a unique timbre. Some boots have added strips of iron to the soles to improve grip, producing occasional sharp clicks when dragging over wooden planks. You realize that these modifications aren't just practical, they also contribute to the acoustic signature of the village's riverside life. You pause to watch a boat glide silently into the current. The oars dip, water swirls, and a solitary fisherman steps from boat to dock. His leather boots strike the boards, a hollow echo carrying across the river. Step by step, he moves like a conductor of a tiny nocturnal orchestra, his rhythm dictating the tempo of activity around him. Even the distant croak of a frog or the gentle lapping of water adds to the composition, enhancing the layered soundscape. Some homes bordering the river have platforms that extend slightly over the water. Residents wear slippers indoors, softly gliding across boards, producing a delicate percussive hum. The effect is mesmerizing. The contrast between outdoor clops and indoor whispers creates a subtle auditory dialogue, a balance between work and domestic quiet, utility and art. Even small accidents are instructive. A slipped sandal or a dragged boot produces a sharp, momentary accent, a surprise in the otherwise steady rhythm. Children, observing, learn both caution and auditory awareness. Every stumble becomes a lesson, every scrape a punctuation mark in the acoustic grammar of riverside life. By the time you follow the last fisherman into his small hut, closing the door behind him, the river's edge has transformed. Leather, hemp, straw, and cloth, each material contributes to the night's symphony. The village exists as much in its sounds as in its streets, each footstep an expression of survival, artistry, and social signaling. You realize that in these quiet nocturnal moments, every step is intentional, purposeful, and part of a living, breathing story. The moon rises higher now, silvering the rooftops and illuminating narrow alleys where few people tread at this hour. Here, your attention is drawn to a different sound, the soft patter of indoor winter shoes, padded with cotton or lined with felt. They whisper against wooden floors, barely audible, but distinct enough to mark movement through sleeping quarters. You probably wouldn't survive a day here without learning to interpret these subtle cues, the difference between someone entering a room and a shadow shifting in the corner. You wander past a scholar's study, noticing the careful rhythm of slippers as he paces while reading scrolls by candlelight. The fabric of his shoes absorbs every minor bump of floorboards, producing a gentle, almost musical rustle. The motion is meditative, a tactile accompaniment to thought, like a heartbeat syncing with ink-stained fingers. Historians still argue whether these sounds were deliberately cultivated for focus or merely incidental, but watching him, you can't help but feel that the rhythm guides cognition itself. Nearby, a scribe dips his brush into ink. Cloth slippers squeak faintly as he shifts weight, balancing over thin tatami mats. Even the sound of a foot barely lifting a mat becomes part of the environment, a punctuation mark in the quiet night. You realize how deeply integrated footwear is in shaping perception. The soft slide of cloth against wood encourages careful movement, attentive posture, and measured breathing. Children practicing calligraphy contribute their own auditory layers. Their smaller slippers shuffle with a hesitant cadence, sometimes uneven, producing playful accents. You hear hesitation, curiosity, and correction in each step, a subtle echo of learning. Some scholars suggest that the auditory feedback from slippers helped reinforce discipline, guiding young hands and feet toward harmony. Others think it was simply practical, preventing scuffs and accidents. Either way, the sound becomes a teaching tool. A curious aspect of winter footwear is insulation. Soft padding doesn't just protect against cold, it muffles motion, allowing the scholar or scribe to work without startling household members. Even pets, quietly padding around, contribute faint percussive patterns that complement human movement. The result is a rich, layered acoustic environment where every step counts, both functionally and aesthetically. Some slippers are more ornate than others. Embroidered symbols, colored threads, and reinforced soles create subtle variations in tone. A decorative stitch rubbing the floor produces a faint swish, a minor accent added to the overall rhythm of the household. You notice how each detail, though visually subtle, contributes to an intricate soundscape. You pause near a low window, listening to a neighboring family's nightly routine. The soft scuff of slippers across bamboo mats, interspersed with occasional cautious clops of leather boots from hallways, creates a layered texture of sound. It is both protective and expressive, a quiet dialogue of motion, intent, and presence. By the time you step outside onto the cool night air again, the streets echo faintly with distant wooden clogs from courtyards farther away. The layering of shoes, from padded winter slippers to lacquered outdoor boots, reveals the symphony of nocturnal life, deliberate, controlled, and yet profoundly human. Every step is both practical and expressive, marking passage through space, hierarchy, and the quiet ritual of evening. The village is now steeped in the stillness of late night, broken only by occasional rustles of small creatures and the distant murmur of the river. You wander along narrow alleyways, noticing the subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm of straw sandals worn by night watchmen or late traveling merchants. The sound is hollow, crisp, and oddly comforting, a gentle percussion against stone and dirt. You probably wouldn't survive the night if you ignored these acoustic cues, for each step carries information about intent, weight, and direction. A watchman shifts his feet carefully atop a wooden platform, the straw soles crunching just enough to mark his presence without startling sleeping villagers. You realize these shoes are not merely practical, they are instruments of discretion. Historians still debate whether the specific weave and thickness of straw was selected for comfort, durability, or simply to manage sound, but standing here, it feels like a carefully engineered balance. Children occasionally slip through the streets on errands, their light cloth slippers barely making a whisper on the cool ground. You notice their cautious pace, a contrast to the confident thud of leather boots belonging to late-arriving tradesmen. Each material produces its own frequency, its own subtle message to anyone listening closely. A straw sandal might communicate vigilance, a silk slipper grace, a leather boot authority. You pause near a bridge spanning a shallow canal. The water below ripples silently, reflecting lantern light, while footsteps, soft, rhythmic, measured, cross above. Some are hurried, alert, others deliberate and lazy. The texture of soles, the angle of the footfall, even the presence of mud or dust, all add nuance to what might seem like a simple sound. Observing this, you recognize that ancient footwear was a language in motion, telling stories without words. Night travelers, especially those moving between villages, often paired their boots with additional accessories. Straps or small metal plates added stability but altered the sound, producing occasional metallic clicks or rhythmic thuds. One small misstep and the noise might echo across rooftops or alert a watchful guard. This careful modulation of noise reflects an awareness of acoustic space you rarely consider today. Inside homes, slippers continue to glide softly. Some families layered mats or textiles to mute movement, turning the act of walking into a slow, meditative process. You notice a playful quirk: young apprentices sometimes imitate these rhythms, learning not only balance but social etiquette through auditory feedback. It's a gentle, almost imperceptible pedagogy conducted entirely by sound. By the time you reach the far edge of the village, the combination of straw, cloth, leather, and silk forms a complex nocturnal symphony. The soundscape of late-night movement is delicate, layered, and intimate. You feel a strange connection to those who walked these streets centuries ago, each step a message, a ritual, and a reflection of human care. Every slipper, sandal, and boot becomes more than mere footwear, it is an extension of rhythm, purpose, and the quiet poetry of daily life. As midnight approaches, the village falls into near-complete silence. Only the occasional drip of condensation from tiled roofs punctuates the stillness. You wander through narrow alleys, noticing the quiet shuffle of padded cloth slippers worn by those tending to small late-night chores, fetching water, checking fires, or adjusting lanterns. You probably wouldn't survive the night here without attuning your ears. Every subtle sound conveys intent, status, or location. A woman carrying a basket of tea leaves moves slowly across wooden planks, her slippers producing a faint swish with each step. The floorboards beneath her knees creak ever so slightly, an added note to the soft rhythm. Historians still argue whether this careful pacing was ritualized or simply a byproduct of domestic caution, but standing here, you sense it's both. Every step conveys attention and mindfulness, a subtle dance between motion and stillness. The night introduces new materials into the acoustic tapestry. Furs and felt-lined slippers soften movement, muffling the sound on stone or earthen floors, while lacquered shoes produce a faint metallic tap when brushed against timber. You notice that even small modifications, padded soles, reinforced tips, slight curving of the toe, affect the way sound travels. It's a delicate balance between practicality and expression. You pause near a small temple tucked between homes. The monk's slippers, simple yet deliberate, glide over bamboo mats. Occasionally, the swish is interrupted by a gentle scrape as sandals adjust over uneven edges. Inside, soft chanting hums through the air, blending with the delicate percussive movements of feet. This layered soundscape becomes a kind of meditation, guiding your own breathing, slowing your pulse, and subtly altering perception. Outside, the occasional stray cat or dog pads by, their tiny paws creating fleeting echoes across rooftops and alleys. Children asleep in upper rooms sometimes shift in their straw-filled mattresses, producing muted thumps. All of these sounds interact with human movement, forming a nocturnal orchestra where footwear is the primary instrument. Some scholars argue that villagers unconsciously calibrated their steps to harmonize with these ambient noises, while others maintain it was purely incidental. You, standing there, feel a subtle rhythm that suggests intention. Even minor accidents carry meaning. A slipper caught on a doorframe produces a small, sharp note, momentarily breaking the otherwise gentle cadence. It signals presence, a reminder of imperfection, and sometimes provokes laughter or sighs from observers. You notice that each micro-interruption enhances your awareness, heightening your attention to the interplay between footwear, floor, and space. By wandering deeper into the backstreets, you hear layers of movement, the soft glide of cloth, the muted rasp of hemp, the occasional metallic tap of reinforced boots. Each material tells a story of its owner, occupation, rank, purpose. Walking through this tapestry, you understand that the village's night is composed not only of shadows and light but of carefully orchestrated steps, a sonic map of human life. And as you settle briefly on a stone bench beneath the silvered rooftops, you realize that even in the darkest hour, the language of shoes continues, a meditation, a social signal, a gentle art form. Every step you hear carries centuries of habit, culture, and quiet poetry. The hour grows late and a cool breeze drifts through narrow lanes, carrying faint scents of incense and night-blooming flowers. You notice the subtle shuffle of straw sandals and padded cloth slippers echoing against the walls of sleeping homes. You probably wouldn't survive if you ignored these tiny sound cues. Even the quietest shuffle can signal movement across a courtyard or alert a pet to your presence. A scholar walks toward a small study, slippers gliding softly on bamboo mats. Each step produces a delicate, swishing hum, occasionally punctuated by the faint scraping of toes against the floor. Historians still debate whether these noises were incidental or cultivated to encourage focus, but here, it feels like a deliberate accompaniment to thought, a rhythm to synchronize mind and body. You follow along, feeling the cadence sink into your own awareness, like the slow, steady tick of a clock. Outside, the occasional clop of a leather boot punctuates the night. A messenger returning from a distant village carries a small satchel, his gait careful to avoid splashing puddles in the alley. The sound contrasts sharply with the softness of indoor slippers, reminding you how context defines the acoustic signature of footwear. Each step is not merely functional, it communicates rank, intent, and care. Children's slippers, smaller and lighter, add playful accents. You hear the subtle tap-tap as a child tiptoes to peek out a window, the uneven rhythm betraying excitement or curiosity. The sound is gentle but purposeful, a reminder that every movement, no matter how slight, contributes to the village's layered nocturnal symphony. Some scholars suggest that this early auditory education helped instill discipline and attentiveness, others argue it was purely accidental, a natural outcome of living in shared spaces. Even domestic tasks produce interesting sounds. A mat is adjusted under a low table, creating a muffled slide, a silk-trimmed slipper brushes against polished wood while fetching a candle, a bamboo basket shifts slightly, producing a soft, hollow patter. These minor noises, normally overlooked, form an intricate, ever-evolving tapestry of sound. You notice that attention to these subtleties heightens perception, enhancing both awareness and appreciation of the space. Nighttime creatures add a final layer. A cat pads silently on wooden beams, an owl's wings stir faint whispers in the distance. Each step and flutter interacts with human footwear, producing overlapping textures in the village soundscape. Even the soft rustle of leaves along the path contributes to this delicate nocturnal orchestration. By now, your ears have adjusted. Cloth, silk, straw, and leather combine to form a multi-layered symphony, each footfall an instrument, each movement a note. You realize that even in the stillest hour, the sound of shoes tells stories, conveys status, and creates a gentle rhythm that structures life. The village is alive in its footsteps, a careful choreography blending function, culture, and subtle artistry. The village now rests under a deep, velvety night sky, and your footsteps are almost inaudible on the earthen paths. Only the soft patter of slippers and the occasional whisper of a straw sandal remind you that life continues in quiet ways. You probably wouldn't survive if you didn't attune yourself to these subtle sounds. Every step, no matter how soft, carries a message of presence, care, and intent. You follow a quiet procession of late-night wanderers, a lantern carrier in padded cloth slippers, a scholar returning from his study, and a young apprentice sneaking a final glimpse of the river before retiring. The interplay of different materials, soft cloth, slightly stiff leather, woven straw, creates a rich nocturnal rhythm, each step contributing to a gentle symphony that carries across courtyards and empty streets. Historians still argue whether these sounds were consciously cultivated to enforce social awareness or if they arose naturally from daily life, but you notice how deliberate each movement seems in this stillness. A fisherman adjusts his straw sandals while preparing his small boat for an early morning voyage. The soft scrape against the dock resonates faintly over the water, blending with distant insect calls and the trickle of the river. Even the smallest irregularity, an uneven step, a dragging sole, adds texture, reminding you that perfection is never required for beauty. The rhythm itself is comforting, like a lullaby made of earth, water, and careful motion. Inside homes, slippers glide across floors, mats shift slightly under cautious steps, and soft swishes mark quiet chores or gentle inspections. Children practicing late-night chores or tending pets add sporadic accents, playful staccatos in the otherwise calm symphony. Each step, each adjustment, is both practical and expressive, a gentle communication of presence, rhythm, and attentiveness. Some homes have polished stone or wooden floors that subtly amplify steps, producing a soft resonance that merges with ambient night sounds. Even minor accidents, a slipper caught on a mat, a heel scraping lightly, create brief punctuation marks in the auditory landscape. You notice how this delicate interplay of motion and sound connects generations, teaching children spatial awareness, discipline, and patience without a single word. As you wander through courtyards, along alleys, and across bridges, you realize that every type of footwear, cloth, silk, leather, or straw, interacts with its environment to form a living, breathing soundscape. It is not merely protection or decoration, but a narrative in motion, expressing identity, purpose, and harmony with surroundings. And finally, as the village sleeps, you pause under the silvered rooftops, breathing in the faint mingling of earth, wood, water, and footsteps. The gentle rhythms of shoes, slippers, and sandals fade into the night, leaving behind an intimate, layered memory of human life, subtle, patient, and profoundly harmonious. Here, you feel the poetry in every step, the music in motion, and the quiet story told by the simplest act of walking. The night stretches out like soft silk, and you let yourself sink into the quiet after so many steps, so many subtle rhythms guiding your journey. The village has gone completely still now, and even the faint echoes of slippers and sandals have softened into memory. You probably wouldn't survive the sensory richness of the day without pausing to notice, but here, in the stillness, every detail seems to settle into gentle harmony. Imagine the wooden floors, the polished stone, the earthen paths all holding the traces of movement, a faint resonance of each footfall, as though the village itself breathes quietly in sleep. The soft hum of night insects mingles with the distant river, and somewhere, a cat pads softly across a roof. Cloth, straw, leather, silk, all these materials leave their acoustic fingerprints, delicate and fleeting, yet meaningful. You realize that every step taken here, every glide of a slipper or tap of a boot, carries centuries of human life, culture, and intention. Your own feet feel grounded, connected to the same rhythms you've been following. Perhaps you imagine the children tiptoeing through dim rooms, the scholars pacing thoughtfully, the fishermen adjusting their sandals by the water. Each footfall is a gentle story, a whisper of habit, a note in a complex nocturnal symphony that the village composes every night. Historians might still argue about the reasons behind these carefully observed movements, but in this calm moment, the explanation feels less important than the experience itself. Take a deep breath, letting the images and sounds you've imagined settle into your mind. Feel the soft textures, hear the quiet layers, and let the rhythmic patterns of ancient shoes lull you into a slow, reflective calm. There's comfort in the patience of footsteps, in the deliberate glides and careful taps that structure life so subtly, so beautifully. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your thoughts drift gently, step by step, through the quiet streets, the soft floors, and the moonlit bridges. Allow the harmony of motion and silence to carry you, and let sleep arrive naturally, guided by the poetry of shoes and the gentle rhythm of human life.